Hello, my name is Ildikó,
And I'm Phil.
and this is the My Open Source Experience podcast, where we discuss all the things about the mechanics of open source in business and in communities. Follow the podcast on your favorite platform and check out the latest episode on Season 3. Here we are, Season 3 of the My Open Source Experience podcast. Unbelievable and a little bit shocking, to me at least. I just can't believe that this is already the third year of the podcast. Phil, Rob, and I started the podcast a little bit over 2 years ago, and I'm so grateful because I was able to talk to a lot of amazing people in the open source ecosystem, both people who were just starting out on their open source journey, as well as people who have had a lot of experiences and are kind of veterans in the open source space. I learned a lot from every single conversation because no one's experience is ever the same. Even if we are going through the same thing, we don't experience that the same way. Whether you're a newcomer and trying to join a new community, or whether you are taking on a leadership position in an open source project, or maybe you're a manager of teams and people who are working upstream in open source projects. Neither of these journeys are simple, and it's never the same experience for people who are going through them. So I'm super happy that I was able to dive into these different experiences with multiple people. And I'm also very grateful to you all who are watching and listening to the podcast. It is your call to action, though. Please like, subscribe, and leave comments at the different episodes of the podcast. And now, let's dive into season 3. However, I'm cheating a little bit because I am giving you a little bit of a sneak peek into season 3 without actually giving you a sneak peek into season 3. So, how does that work? I have a few topic areas that I will be talking about in this intro episode for season 3. And I have a few guests for you from season 2 who will be talking about some topic areas that they haven't covered yet in the previous season on the podcast so far. So, without further ado, let's see what we are talking about today. Let's start with events. And when I say events, I talk about open source conferences that could be about a particular open source project or about open source at large. All these events and conferences are super important and crucial for the sustainability and success of the open source ecosystem at large. But I have someone who is much better than me at describing the value of open source conferences and especially attending them in person or supporting your team and employees to go and attend them. And this person is Stephen Walli.
So in good technical developer events, so things like we see at FOSDEM scale, some of the more technical events that you see coming out of the Eclipse Foundation or the Linux Foundation, I think that's where people get confronted with the reality of this idea of build versus buy versus borrow and share, and how do you think about taking that dependency. And I think that's the thing. And I think they learn it at all levels. I mean, an engineer is being exposed to a new piece of technology at the same time that they start to realize that in the better talks, they're realizing, oh, this is how I engage with those developers that are publishing that software. I think their managers get to see that as well of, oh, this looks like a really useful tool for us to go use. but in seeing kind of the slightly chaotic environment around it of a room full of people asking, questions, the energy in the conversation, you start realizing, how do I manage this as the product manager, as the engineering manager? Like how do I think about this engagement that I'm clearly seeing in front of me so I can start to think about it as a managed dependency in our product world? I think you only get that from showing up in the conferences to really start to understand that. I think some conferences do an outrageously good job. OpenStack Summit and Day Zero. I mean, that was shocking the first time I saw that when I went to work for Hewlett Packard. The idea that Day Zero is this, oh, you're new here. Let us show you how you can be successful for your needs. Same thing happens Day Zero in the IETF standards meetings, is the, oh, you're new here. Let us show you how to be successful. So I think that kind of, thoughtfulness in the organizers, that kind of exposure for managers and developers. For folks like me, it's a different experience. And like, so when the three of us get together because of our backgrounds and because of our responsibilities within our current employers, that's that opportunity where we figure out what are the next things we need to be talking about, where we need to be thoughtful. How do we have the security conversation? How do we, and it's not necessarily that there wasn't a very good OpenSSF security day on the first day of the conference. It's the conversations that got provoked out of that, as Microsoft and Ericsson talk as good partners in the industry about what we might do with some of this information. Yeah, it's so I think the events work at all different levels. The hard thing, and again, it always comes back to culture. Hard thing there is, turns out a lot of institutions consider conference travel to be a perk for an engineer. That's an old culture thing. And, the idea that, well, we can't send our engineers to these things because they're fun, that might have made some sense 10, 20, 30 years ago when conferences were different. But in the open source space, it's important, if you're going to figure out how you're going to manage that dependency, for your engineers to be in the room figuring out enough of what this dependency means.
Now that you know why you and your colleagues, your team members, and your friends should be attending open source conferences, what are the ones that are still upcoming that you should add to your calendar and travel plans? The next one is All Things Open. It is happening in the middle of October between the 13th and 15th. All Things Open is in Raleigh, North Carolina. Now, next, we will be jumping to the exact opposite end of the planet or side of the planet, all the way to Australia, because that is where everything open will happen between January 21st and 23rd. Now, if you're scratching your head about this conference, I gotta share with you that this used to be LinuxConf Australia. They renamed and rebranded the event because they realized that it is much more than just talking about Linux by this point in time. So if you're in the region or if you were looking for an excuse to visit Australia, I think this is your perfect opportunity to go and do a little bit of open source and check out Australia while you're there. Now, if you're looking for a similar event, but somewhere else on the globe, then you can hop over to Brussels, Belgium on January 31st and February 1st, which is when FOSDEM will be happening next year in 2026. FOSDEM is also a volunteer organized, amazing, chaotic, crazy open source event. What you also need to know about FOSDEM is happening over the weekend. However, there are so many co-located events that are happening in Brussels that week, and some companies and teams are also organizing their team meetings and gatherings in the city, that this event really outgrew itself and provided an opportunity for the open source ecosystem to collaborate closer together. So just think about mingling between open source projects and also discussing anything around business around open source. Then, if you are already in the area, then you might as well hop over to the United Kingdom and attend State of the Open Con, which will be happening on February 3rd and 4th. We're still staying in Europe for FOSS Backstage, which I think is in Berlin, Germany, on March 16th and 17th. For this one, similar to FOSDEM, the CFP hasn't closed yet. So for FOSDEM, the call for papers usually happens sometime around October, November, December, depending on the dev rooms. For FOSS Backstage, the CFP or call for papers is currently open and will remain open until the 27th of October. So if you don't just want to attend, but you also have a topic that you would like to speak about, don't forget to submit your proposal. And there are many other events. I will sneak in some more project and ecosystem focused events. The first is Open Infra Summit Europe, which will be happening in Paris-Saclay in France on October 17th till the 19th. The CFP is unfortunately already closed, but if you have a use case or a project that is relying on software infrastructure, this is your event to attend. If you're interested in the container space, then KubeCon North America is another event that you should check out between November 10th and the 13th. And the Europe occasion of KubeCon will be happening between March 23rd and 26th in 2026. The CFP for KubeCon North America is already closed for this year, but the one for KubeCon EU is still open and will remain open until the 12th of October. So again, if you have a topic area that you would like to present about, this is your time to submit your session proposal. I know that I mentioned a lot of events all around the globe, which kind of means that if you wanted, you could be on the roads almost every week, every second week for a good chunk of the year. And I'm not saying that you have to do that. So, what I like to do is look into events that are closer to my area and region, which might be more accessible, and seek out some of those events that are highly relevant to what I do. And even if they are further away, I try to make an effort to go and attend them. So again, a call to action to you. Look into the upcoming events and mark those that you're interested in. If they still have a call for papers open, consider submitting a talk. And I hope to see you at some of these upcoming amazing open source conferences. Let's talk about AI, shall we? Because I don't think that you can get away with running a show, a podcast, even about open source without talking at least a little bit about artificial intelligence. We do have an open source AI definition that was rolled out by the Open Source Initiative throughout a long process of talking to experts in the open source and AI ecosystem to make sure that people have a good understanding of the space and what an open source AI definition could and should be. The 1.0 version is already available, and now the open source initiative, as well as the bigger open source ecosystem, is looking into one particular aspect as a next step, which is data. Because, as you all know, not all data can be shared publicly. We talk about people's private and sensitive information. It is not something that you can and should share as part of an AI model. So, when it comes to AI, the definition of what it means when we say open source AI is a little bit different than for things like software or documentation. So that one is already very challenging. And so data is one thing. And then there's another thing that we already brought up in different contexts a little bit on season 2, which is copyright. It was, I think, Stephen Walli at the beginning of the season who talked about how copyright is already a stretch to apply to software because software by design is continuously changing. When it comes to copyright, it doesn't really do well with things that are continuously changing. So, again, applying it to software is a little bit of a stretch. One would say a little bit too much of a stretch, but it happened anyway. Can we stretch it further for AI? Or is it the time to come up with something else? And so I have a segment for you here from our conversation with Ria Farrell Schalnat about AI and copyright and what could or should come in that space.
As you've gone through that in the previous iteration of a technology evolution, as you look at AI and models and you look forward 20 to 30 years, do you think we'll make the same statement that, gee, when this thing came out, we should have come up with some other regime than trying to shove patents and copyright law into how to actually manage models and what those look like going forward? I mean, I see very similar aspects to where we are with AI, as far as just the systems that are in place don't really fit well with what a model is and how it's constructed and how it's used.
Oh, I agree.
If you prognosticate going forward, do you see the same kind of analogy?
Yes, I think there's definitely lots of different camps that all have their own ideas about how to protect AI or whether it should even be protected. And it's even more nuanced and complicated than just open source because you've got software that runs AI, you've got the models, you've got the training data, and you also have the weights that are these matrices of numbers and statistics that also don't fit into any area of IP very easily. So you put all 4 of those together and you're balancing a lot of different components. And then on top of that, you have new licensing that is coming out right now and that is trying to capture one or more aspects of what AI is. There's even fierce debates going on over what the open artificial intelligence definition should be in the open source initiative that I've been following as that has been evolving over the last year. And I know there's lots of different camps with different opinions about where things should fall in open versus proprietary for OpenAI.
I think the 1.0 version of the open source AI definition is already available on the OSI website, but I think everyone is kind of agreeing that it might not be the last version of the open source AI definition, just because how the space has been evolving and how people's understandings and where they converge on how to handle all this. There have been like long heated debates on occasions in terms of what to do with the training data, especially. I think that was one of the biggest I don't know, controversy, debate. I don't know what the best word is, but like you must share the data, but you can't always share the data. What about, privacy and personal information and all those kind of things? And it really feels like that this is a space that should be evolving even down to the level of definitions, because at least personally, I'm not sure we have enough understanding to say that this is something so firm that it's going to hold up for the next, I don't know, 30 years, 50, 100, forever.
I definitely think legislation is going to come into play. The question is, will the genie be out of the bottle, that the world will just have moved forward and tried to chart its own path in the absence of legislation? Because that takes time to develop. It takes time for elected representatives to understand the space, to figure out how to draft laws around that space, and then to implement it and enforce it. That then gives rise to case law, because there's going to subsequently be litigation over that legislation that will further refine and develop our understanding of that. So we're not going to have answers on this for some time, I think. But that's the interesting times we live in. And that's one of the really fun parts about working in both intellectual property and even open source specifically, that it's always changing, it's always evolving, and there's always something new to learn.
Yeah, I mean, I see this change as being substantial. I mean, I have to imagine that being a lawyer with that experience of tech and open source, because open source is playing a relatively large part in the discussion around AI. I mean, we have legislation that's calling out open source, and that's part of the problem, is nobody can define what open source AI is, and yet we have legislation that references it. We're all like, what does that mean? But this is, I mean, it must be an exciting time to be a lawyer with that background in open source and technology and software, because we are, you are one of those that are feeling your way in the dark, right? This is brand new space. What are we going to do with this thing?
Absolutely. It's very much like the early days when people were trying to figure out what the open source definition was going to be. And I'm sure there were very heated debates about that. I wasn't in those rooms at the time, but it certainly is something that is settled now, but it was by no means settled 30 years ago.
Exactly. But no, fun times.
Yeah, and I know that there were iterations of the open source definition itself as well, and yeah, the AI one is just even more complex than that one. Let's talk about open source maintainers, because they are the people who are the pillars of open source communities. They have a lot of responsibilities, and often, or at least sometimes, they don't have a lot of help. And very, very often, very, very sadly, they are also the people who aren't necessarily paid to do the maintenance work in the open source project, because companies and organizations very often are, let's say, happy to pay people to submit feature implementations, as well as bug fixes that are important for the company to be merged and fixed. When it comes to the maintenance work on an open source project, things like ensuring that there are people who are doing code reviews, ensuring backwards compatibility for the APIs, fixing vulnerabilities, and also maintaining a vulnerability process, not just providing the fixes. And this is a lot of responsibility and work. And if you're not paid to do it, Many people often fall into the habit of doing it on the side in their free time, but you only get so much free time. And then eventually you just get exhausted and burned out. And that's when the community around these maintainers, if they are overloaded and stretched too thin, start to crumble. No one wants that. So, what can we do? Open source maintainers and project teams, they can say no. Sometimes project maintainers need to draw some boundaries and also guide people how they can help to take on responsibilities and share the burden that the project maintainers have in the project. Another important aspect to think about is that having communities around open source projects, it's not a given. It is work. I have a segment for you with Kelsey Hightower where he talks about all this in a bit more detail.
I think the tricky part is that, and I always get in trouble when I mention this, especially like online, the community and all that other stuff is bonus. Open source to me literally is my source code under an appropriate license shared with you. That's it. I might even disable issues and pull requests. It's still an open source project. It may not have a community, but it's still an open source project. And honestly, I would rather someone who doesn't have bandwidth for all the other things still share. You know what I mean? Like if you cure cancer and you want to give people the data and the program that proves it, please share it. And then we can go validate whether that works or not. I'd rather have that than someone say, well, you don't have a community and it shouldn't exist. Like, that's bonus. Because I think the ability to say no is so important. And everyone's like, no, this is a community. You should take my changes. It's like, that's not honest. You're not being very honest because it's not take your contribution. It's to be responsible forever of your contribution. We like curated things. I like to hear a song by a specific artist. They shouldn't take everyone's lyrics. I want to hear their lyrics. When I go buy a particular food item, it's from a particular restaurant. They're opinionated, right? And they curate their menu and their ingredients, and it tastes a certain way. It's not designed by committee. And I think this is where a lot of things get into trouble. Look, some things benefit from committee, like HTTP 3. Yeah, the whole internet's going to have to use it. Then you're probably going to have to get some input from a lot of the stakeholders involved. No problem. But when you start talking to a solo maintainer and say, hey, you need to get more people reviewing this stuff. There's a timeline. Where's the stickers? Where's the swag? I want to contribute. I want to rewrite your project in Rust. It's like, I am under no obligation to do that because the responsibility is overwhelming for that. So we need way more empathy too. So look, if you want to have a community and you want to do all these community things, state your governance model, state your contribution guidelines, communicate when those things need to change, and then have at it. But I've been on the other side of that where if you're a company like Google having to pay 100 engineers to work on an open source project, it's really hard to have them reviewing the rest of the world's code forever and then deal with the political consequences of taking on this thing versus that one thing because decisions need to get made. And look, this stuff gets into humanity real quick. It starts becoming a government. Here's how we vote. Sometimes there's a benevolent dictator who understands more of the system than everyone else. And they say no because they can see what you can't see. And it's really hard to accept their decision because you feel like it's our project. And it ain't our project. There's a project that's typically being maintained by a group of maintainers, and they got to make a decision of what's best for everyone, including the maintainability of it. And look, remember, there's always that release valve. If you truly believe what you believe, there's that button. You totally click it, and you can add these features there and then plead your case by getting some adoption in the wild, really proving out that this thing needs to be there. So yeah, that's part of it. But I do think these are separate things. Communities are an additive to open source Some of the best open source projects have some of the best communities, but it ain't a requirement.
I love this segment with Kelsey because it highlights all the aspects of the open source ecosystem that we very often just take for granted. Like having an open source project and a community around it, especially for companies and corporate organizations, very often they look at it as the community itself was another company with all the responsibilities that come with maintaining and develop that particular open source project further that they look after and maintain. It is very easy to see yourself as an entity outside of that community. And since the code and artifacts are available under an open source license, you just grab them and use them. But if there is a problem with that code base, that is the community's responsibility, right? Like, I don't have to do anything about that. Up until today, this was mostly working. However, let's talk a little bit about the Cyber Resilience Act, which is a new legislation in Europe. Because the Cyber Resilience Act is targeting to regulate the software space from cybersecurity perspective, trying to make sure that the software-based products and services are well maintained and secure, because the EU Commission recognizes that most people live their lives through digital services. And that means that we are always threatened by cybersecurity vulnerabilities and attacks. The CRA itself was not created to regulate open source. However, when open source is part of a product or service that is made available as part of a company's business on the EU market, that open source project and code becomes subject to the CRA. You would think that the open source communities will be responsible for that too. That is not the case anymore, because the EU regulation says that the company who brings the product and service that contains the open source component onto the EU market, they are responsible for reporting the vulnerability that they found in that software component, but they are also responsible to submit the fix for that vulnerability if they have it. What the CRA says in practice is that if you are a company who is integrating and relying on an open source project and component, fixing bugs and vulnerabilities is your responsibility. So the responsibility chain ends with you. There is no way to point fingers at the open source community that this is their responsibility to fix a particular bug or vulnerability. It is now your responsibility as a company or organization, again, who has a product on the EU market. That also means that if you are located outside the EU, but you shipped, again, products or services to that market, the CRA applies to you just as much as it applies to everybody else in the EU. Open source projects should have good security measures and practices. They should have a vulnerability process that is documented and is easy to find, discover, and follow for users and contributors of that project, which will make it much easier for companies and organizations to go and report those bugs and vulnerabilities that they found in the software. If you are concerned that you're reporting a vulnerability that is not fixed yet and it will be public information how to exploit that vulnerability, then most projects who do have a vulnerability process also have an embargo process built into that, which means that the information about the vulnerability will not be disclosed until the vulnerability does have a fix, and for users, a way to apply that fix in their environments. If the project that you are dependent on does not have a clear vulnerability process, or it does not have an embargo period baked into that process, this is your opportunity to get involved and propose one. In the commercial context, open source is sustainable software development. So if you think about public infrastructure like the roads out there that are maintained by the country's governments in most cases, they are part of the public good. Everyone relies on them. So it is everybody's responsibility to have them maintained. And that's why we pay taxes. And also people work in the industry who go and fixes these roads. Open source software is very similar because all of us are relying on open source software and software infrastructure that depends on open source code. So why aren't we maintaining that infrastructure together? And it's not just the concept of maintaining something together that we all rely on. In fact, it is much cheaper and more efficient to do maintenance work and development work upstream in these open source projects that are high priority dependencies for companies. If everyone does that, then we will not have burnt out maintainers, and you will have the vulnerability fixes, the bug fixes available faster, and everyone who relies on that particular project will have them as well. So we can all share the burden. You can invest in the maintenance of these software components, especially if they are high up on your dependency tree and they are high priority dependencies for you. You can, let's say, quote unquote, pay taxes and support open source foundations, as well as support the communities directly with funding. And what you should absolutely do if the open source project is part of your product or core service, you need to invest in doing maintenance and development work upstream, because that is the missing piece that will make it sustainable for you to keep maintaining your product and service that does have open source components built into it. And not just because of the CRA, but if you miss doing at least some of the maintenance work upstream, then the CRA penalties are actually pretty high. By the end of 2027, you will have to be compliant with the CRA regulations. So look into the deadlines as well as the progress of the standardization work, things that, for example, Etsy is doing as a standards body that the Linux Foundation is now a member of, so that open source projects and communities can participate in the standardization efforts a little more closer to make sure that the standards are applying well to open source projects so that the CRA doesn't make things any harder than they already are, as well as look into the OpenSSF Foundation, who is working on both providing resources and materials about the CRA, working with policy makers to roll out the phases of the CRA, as well as working with open source projects and communities to make sure that they are compliant with regulations, as well as have good security processes and measures. Let's talk a little bit about the public sector. I already mentioned the Cyber Resilience Act in Europe. That is one approach that governments are taking in terms of open source and, well, in terms of software projects and infrastructure, including open source. But this is not the only way how governments are approaching the open source space. For example, Phil and I talked to Federico Gonzalez Waite on season 2, and he shared his experience with us as kind of a case study in terms of how the Mexican government has approached the open source space. And what they did, they actually rolled out policies that were in favor of using and relying on open source software as part of the government's tools and infrastructure that they use, and also as a recommendation to the public sector, and then having that trickle out to the corporate sector as well. And so far, Mexico seems to have a very good experience with switching over to more open source based solutions rather than keeping everything proprietary coming from proprietary vendors. Because the government recognized that using proprietary software means that they are locked in and they are somewhat at the mercy of the software vendor companies. And it's not a good thing. So, they started an experiment and an approach where they started to build their own tools and infrastructure using open source software. You can think of projects like the Linux kernel and OpenStack, Kubernetes, and more. And by relying on open source projects, they were able to take control over their infrastructure, be more educated about what is being put in place, how those components work, and they had access to very often global communities with experts about how those projects and software components work. I have a segment for you with Federico where he talks about this and the value of open source in a bit more detail.
When you talk about implementing open source, people tend to think that you're crazy. Surprisingly enough, one of the ones that has created one of the most private technologies wrote that the people that are crazy enough to think that they can change the world can change it. And that was Steve Jobs. So I think we do need to be kind of like crazy, especially if we are in these government roles. So anybody that's working government and that's thinking about doing open source implementations or leading a big agency, I think you need to be crazy enough. You need to have a fearless ideology because everybody is going to question what you do. But I do think it's the right track. So like, and a lot of people sometimes also think about like how does the legislation have to breach the technology, and a lot of the time what I saw was that that's not true. Like legislation and manuals and processes can be modified in order to adjust to new technologies, but we shouldn't be afraid of that. We shouldn't be afraid about the capacity that people are going to have because people, when they want to learn, they can learn, and that can be a very big thing for launching and driving technology forward. So we just need to try to work in being fearless leaders in doing these digital transformations towards open source in whatever way that you want to do it, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's in artificial intelligence now, whether it is platforms, because there's always a way. And as long as you manage the people side of it the right way, everything would be a success. And remember that you're not alone. There is a community out there. There are people that have done this before. I'm happy to be reached out. Like people can look for me in LinkedIn and send me a message. Like I've already had it where people say like, oh, we heard that we did this. And if we have, or we did find the solution at some point, we're happy to do it. So just don't be afraid about taking on these kind of challenges. And whenever you can, try to evangelize people, and like back to the big question of how do we make people understand our tribe and understand this. I think when we start talking about it, because I think it's also one of those things that we talk about it within ourselves, but a lot of time we don't talk to other people. No? So once we can convince our administration person that the technology is worth it and it can have a lot of benefits and it does save money, and then there's a community. What I've also seen is that once those kind of people are convinced, then they are the ones that ask for open source solutions.
Yeah, they become evangelists. Yeah,
and they become your supporters. No, and whether it's within your institution or when they move to another institution, then they are the evangelists, and they're also pulling everything towards this ideology that we've got. And I think what we're doing as a worldwide movement, it's amazing. I think it's just being part of this community has really changed perspective on things, and just there are some really interesting people within the community. So if you're from outside the community, you're always welcome to come and talk to us as well.
I'm super excited because season 3 is kicking off and starting, and I have a brand new episode with a new guest for you next week already. And it is from the telecommunications segment, and it will dive a little bit into business aspects of open source. And our guest will be Magnus Bergard, and I hope you will love that episode. And what else do we have coming for season 3? We will be diving into the telecommunications segment a little bit more with another guest as well. And we also have guests talking about the automotive industry. And if you think about it, both telecommunications and automotive are highly regulated and standardized industry segments. So they might share similar challenges and might see similar values in open source. We will see from the episodes in season 3. We will also talk a little bit more about AI, a little bit more about copyright and the legal aspects of open source, as well as diving into topic areas like diversity and inclusivity. And that one is very near and dear to my heart. My podcast guest and I will be talking about topic areas such as what is it like to be a woman in tech and a woman in open source, and the challenges that we face, and also the good experiences and the rewards that we get from the open source ecosystem. So stay tuned because season 3 is kicking off right now with a lot of amazing new content. And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. We want to hear from you. Please leave comments under the episodes that you watched. Share your feedback and share your experiences to continue the conversation. And let us know what topics you would like to hear next. Stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.